When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this, especially at the hands of the people you love the most, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to Voice of Legends. Your stories matter, and you are not alone. I remember the smell of that courtroom more than anything else. Old paper, disinfectant, and something faintly metallic, like fear had soaked into the walls over decades. My shoes clicked too loudly against the tile as I walked in, each step echoing like it was announcing my presence to people who wished I wasn't there. I held my purse close to my chest, not because I was afraid someone would take it, but because it was the only thing grounding me, the only familiar weight in a room that already felt hostile. That's when I saw him, my son, sitting at the long table to the right, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded together so tightly his knuckles were pale. He didn't look up, not even for a second. His eyes were fixed on his shoes, as if they were the most fascinating thing in the world. Black leather, scuffed at the toe. I knew those shoes. I bought them for him 3 years earlier for his birthday because he said he needed something respectable for work. For a moment, I thought maybe he hadn't noticed me yet, that maybe if I said his name softly the way I used to when he was a child afraid of thunderstorms, he would look up, smile, mouth the word mom. But before I could even breathe in enough air to try, I saw her, his wife. She sat beside him, spine straight, chin lifted, her hand resting lightly on his arm like a claim. And when her eyes met mine, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not an awkward one. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of smile someone gives when they know something you don't, when they're already 10 steps ahead and enjoying watching you catch up. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might actually hear it hit the floor. That was the moment something inside me shifted, a quiet click, like a lock turning. I realized I hadn't walked into court to support my son. I had walked into a trap. As I took my seat behind my attorney, memories came rushing in uninvited. My son as a little boy, running toward me with scraped knees and tears in his eyes. My son at 16, slamming doors and shouting that I didn't understand him, only to apologize hours later with red eyes and a sheepish hug. My son on his wedding day, standing at the altar, hands shaking as he mouthed "thank you" to me from across the room. I had raised him alone after his father passed. Every sacrifice, every late night, every worry had been for him. And now he couldn't even look at me. The judge hadn't entered yet, and the room buzzed with low murmurs, lawyers flipping through folders, people whispering. I felt exposed, like everyone knew why I was there, like they had already decided who I was. The woman who refused to let go, the difficult mother-in-law, the obstacle. I glanced again at my son, hoping, foolishly, that he might look up this time. He didn't. Instead, his wife leaned closer to him and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw his jaw tighten. He nodded once, just once, like a man agreeing to something he didn't have the courage to argue against. I thought back to the first time I sensed her dislike for me. It had been subtle, a comment here, a look there. She would say things like, "You don't have to call your mom every day," with a laugh that sounded light but felt sharp. Or, "We're starting our own family now," as if I were an outdated piece of furniture they needed to clear out. I told myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe my son was happy, that love meant compromise, that I was just adjusting to a new role. When they asked me to co-sign on a loan for the house, I didn't hesitate. It was my home too, technically. I had put the down payment from my savings, the money I'd scraped together over decades. The agreement was simple, or so I thought. We would all live there temporarily, and when they were stable enough, my name would come off the paperwork. Family helps family. That's what I taught my son. What I didn't teach him was how to stand up to manipulation. The judge entered and everyone stood. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself up, my heart pounding loudly. I was sure the microphones would pick it up. As we sat back down, the room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the judge's voice calling the case number. Our case number. This was real. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be cleared up over coffee. This wasn't a family argument that time would soften. This was legal, permanent, public. As the opening statements began, I listened to words being used to describe me that didn't feel like they belonged to my life. Controlling, interfering, financially manipulative. Each word felt like a small cut, precise and intentional. I wanted to turn around and ask my son if he recognized the woman they were talking about, if he remembered who packed his lunches, who stayed up all night when he had a fever, who worked 2 jobs so he could go to college. But I stayed quiet. I had learned over the past year that speaking too quickly only gave them more ammunition. My attorney squeezed my arm gently, a silent reminder to breathe. I focused on the wood grain of the table in front of me, grounding myself in something solid. Across the room, I could feel her eyes on me again, that same smile, faint but unmistakable, confident. She knew something, or she thought she did. And as the first witness was called, a cold realization settled over me like a heavy coat. Whatever this was, whatever story they had constructed, my son had agreed to it. He had signed his name to a version of events where I was no longer his mother, but a problem to be removed. I didn't know yet how the day would end. I didn't know what evidence would be shown or what truths would come out. But sitting there, listening to my life be rewritten by strangers, I understood one painful truth with absolute clarity. The boy I raised was gone, and the man sitting in front of me had chosen someone else's version of reality over the woman who gave him everything. When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. They called my name sooner than I expected. Hearing it echo through the courtroom felt unreal, like I was watching someone else stand up in my place. My legs moved before my mind fully caught up, and I walked to the witness stand with a calm I didn't feel. I placed my hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down, smoothing my skirt the way I always did when I was nervous. Old habits don't disappear just because your heart is breaking. As I looked out at the room, my eyes found my son again without permission. He still wouldn't look at me. His wife, however, leaned back slightly, arms crossed now, her smile gone but replaced with something just as unsettling, certainty. She believed this was already over. The questions started gently. My name, my relationship to the defendant, how long we had lived together. I answered clearly, evenly, forcing my voice to stay steady. I had practiced this in my head 100 times late at night when sleep wouldn't come. I told myself that if I stayed calm, if I didn't let emotion take over, the truth would speak for itself. Then the tone shifted. They asked about the house, the loan, the paperwork. They asked why my name was still on the deed. They asked if I had ever threatened to sell the house or force them out. The words felt twisted, like they had been bent just enough to resemble lies without quite snapping back into the truth. I explained carefully that my name remained because that was the agreement, that I had never threatened anyone, that I only asked for transparency, for respect, for acknowledgement that I had put my life savings into that home. As I spoke, I could feel my son shrinking further into himself. His shoulders curled inward, his head dipped even lower. It was the posture of a child being scolded, not a man confident in his choices. When they brought up the accusations that I had manipulated him emotionally, that I had interfered in his marriage, I felt something hot flare in my chest. Not anger, grief. A deep, aching grief for the years I had spent teaching him to be kind, to be honest, to stand up for what was right. I answered anyway. I said I had opinions, like any mother. I said I voiced concerns when I felt disrespected or excluded. I said loving your child doesn't stop the day they get married, even if some people wish it did. That's when they called her to the stand. She walked up with practiced confidence, heels clicking sharply across the floor. She swore her oath without hesitation and sat down, crossing her legs neatly. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost fragile. It was a performance I had seen before, one she reserved for outsiders. To them, she was gentle, reasonable, patient. To me, she had always been sharp and calculated. She told a story where she was the victim, a young wife overwhelmed by an intrusive mother-in-law, a woman trying to build a life while being constantly undermined. She said I controlled my son with guilt, that I used money to keep power over them, that I refused to let go. And then she said something that made the room go very still. She claimed I forged documents. Forgery? Fraud. Serious words, heavy with implication. My attorney immediately objected, but the seed had been planted. I turned to my son then, really turned, searching his face for some sign of disbelief, some flicker of recognition that this had gone too far. He didn't look up. That's when it hit me harder than anything else that day. This wasn't just her story. This was their story. He had heard these words before. He had let them stand. He had agreed, silently or otherwise, that this was who I was now. My attorney asked for permission to submit evidence, and the judge nodded. A folder was handed up, thick and well organized. I recognized it immediately. Copies of emails, bank statements, signed agreements, things I had insisted on keeping, things my son once teased me about. "You and your paperwork, Mom," he used to say with a smile. Those papers were my lifeline now. As the judge reviewed them, my attorney walked the court through each document, explaining dates, signatures, transfers. He pointed out inconsistencies in her testimony. He showed that every document bore legitimate signatures, that funds were transferred transparently, that nothing had been done without their knowledge or consent. I watched the color drain from her face inch by inch. The confidence cracked. She shifted in her seat, uncrossed her legs, glanced at her lawyer. The smile was completely gone now. Finally, the judge looked up and asked her a direct question about one of the emails, an email she claimed never existed. She hesitated, just for a second, but in a courtroom, a second is loud. She answered anyway, stumbling slightly, her earlier smoothness gone. The judge frowned, turned back to the papers, and made a note. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief, not yet, just the knowledge that the truth was finally in the room. When my son was called to testify, the air felt heavy enough to press down on my shoulders. This was the moment that mattered most to me, not legally, emotionally. He stood slowly, walked to the stand, and sat down. For the first time since I entered the courtroom, he looked at me, just briefly. His eyes were red, tired, haunted. In that glance, I saw the boy I raised and the man he had become colliding painfully. They asked him simple questions at first: his name, his relationship to me, to his wife. Then they asked him to confirm the accusations. He swallowed hard. His voice was barely audible as he answered, "Yes, no, I don't know." It was clear he was repeating something he had been coached on, something rehearsed. Then my attorney stood. He asked my son about the down payment, about the agreement they had signed, about the email where my son thanked me for helping them start their future. My son hesitated again, looked at his wife. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. That's when my son broke. He admitted the email existed. He admitted the agreement was mutual. He admitted, quietly, that I had never threatened him. The courtroom was silent except for his voice cracking under the weight of truth he could no longer hold back. His wife stared straight ahead now, her jaw clenched. The judge thanked my son and dismissed him. As he walked past me back to his seat, our arms brushed, just slightly. It felt like touching a stranger. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was firm but measured. He stated clearly that the evidence did not support the accusations against me, that there was no proof of fraud or manipulation, that the case, as presented, lacked credibility. Legally, it was over, but emotionally, I had never felt more hollow. As people began to stand and gather their things, I remained sitting for a moment, letting it all settle. I hadn't lost the case. I had won on paper, but I had lost something far more precious. My son stood near the exit, uncertainty written all over his face. His wife was already walking ahead, her posture stiff, anger radiating off her. For a split second, he looked like he might turn back, like he might say something, anything. He didn't. I gathered my purse, stood up, and walked out of the courtroom alone. Each step felt lighter and heavier all at once. The truth had been spoken. My dignity was intact. But the boy who once ran to me with scraped knees was gone, replaced by a man who chose silence over loyalty. Outside, the air felt cleaner. I took a deep breath and realized something important. I hadn't lost my son that day because of a courtroom. I lost him the moment he decided it was easier to let me be the villain than to face the truth. And with that realization came a quiet resolve. I could not force him to choose me, but I could choose myself. When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. I sat in my car for a long time after leaving the courthouse, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my forehead pressed against it like I was too tired to hold myself up anymore. The engine was off. The radio was silent. The world outside moved on as if nothing monumental had happened, as if a mother hadn't just watched her child step away from her in the most final way possible. I didn't cry right away. That surprised me. I had expected tears, sobs even, the kind that shake your chest and leave you gasping. Instead, there was a strange emptiness, like someone had reached inside me and scooped something vital out, leaving a hollow space behind. I breathed in slowly, counting to 4, the way I used to teach my son when he was anxious before exams. In through the nose, out through the mouth, over and over. On the drive home, memories ambushed me at every red light. The park where I taught him to ride a bike, the grocery store where he once begged for candy and then proudly paid with his own allowance, the intersection where he cried in the passenger seat after his first heartbreak, asking me why loving someone hurt so much. I had told him then that love didn't hurt by itself, that people hurt when they're afraid or confused. I wondered if he remembered that conversation now. When I pulled into my driveway, the house looked different to me. Quieter, smaller, like it knew something had shifted. This house had once been full of laughter, arguments, late-night talks at the kitchen table. Now it echoed with absence. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, setting my purse down carefully as if any sudden movement might shatter what little composure I had left. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face in the courtroom, the way his mouth trembled when he told the truth, the way he still didn't choose me afterward. I replayed everything, wondering if there was a moment I could have done something differently, if one softer word or one firmer boundary might have changed the outcome. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but so did clarity. For months, no, for years, I had been bending myself into smaller and smaller shapes to keep the peace. I had apologized for things I hadn't done. I had swallowed my pride to avoid conflict. I had told myself that patience was love, even when patience meant erasing myself. I realized I couldn't do that anymore. The first thing I did was call my attorney to finalize the paperwork that would formally remove me from any shared financial obligations. It was clean now, clear. Mine was mine, theirs was theirs. There would be no more entanglements disguised as family support. The second thing I did surprised even me. I wrote my son a letter. Not a long one, not an angry one. I sat at the dining table with a blank piece of paper for nearly an hour before the words came. When they did, they were simple and honest. I told him I loved him. I told him I was proud of the man he had become, even if I didn't agree with the choices he had made. I told him that I would always be his mother, but that I needed distance to heal. I ended it by saying that my door would remain open, but I would not chase him anymore. I didn't ask for an apology. I didn't defend myself. I didn't accuse his wife of anything. For the first time, I let go of the need to be understood. Dropping that letter into the mailbox felt like releasing a breath I had been holding for years. The weeks that followed were strange, quiet, painful in unexpected ways. I would reach for my phone to call him, then stop. I would cook too much food out of habit, then stare at the leftovers, unsure what to do with them. Friends checked in, some awkwardly, some with genuine warmth. A few admitted they had seen the tension for a long time but hadn't known how to help. One afternoon, I ran into my son's wife at the grocery store. I wasn't prepared for it. My heart raced. My palms went cold. She saw me too. For a moment, we just stood there, frozen between the produce and the dairy aisle. She looked different, tired, not triumphant. The confidence she had worn in the courtroom was gone, replaced by something brittle. She nodded at me stiffly. I nodded back. No words passed between us. As I walked away, I realized something unexpected. I didn't feel afraid of her anymore. Whatever power she had held over me had dissolved the moment I stopped fighting to be seen. I understood then that people who manipulate others rely on reaction, on chaos, on emotional engagement. My silence was no longer weakness, it was freedom. I started filling my days with things that belonged only to me. Morning walks, volunteering at the local community center, reconnecting with friends I had neglected while trying to keep my family together. Slowly, the house began to feel like a home again, not a waiting room for someone who might never return. One evening, months later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. My heart knew before my mind did. It was my son. He didn't say much. He asked how I was. He said he hoped I was doing well. There was an apology buried between careful sentences, not fully formed but present. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the old ache resurface. I typed a reply slowly. I told him I was well, that I hoped he was too. I told him I was glad he reached out, and then I stopped. I didn't invite him over. I didn't reopen wounds. I didn't pretend everything was fixed. Love doesn't mean access. I had learned that the hard way. As I put my phone down, I felt something settle inside me. Peace, maybe, or acceptance. I understood now that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, even when your heart begs you not to. I walked into that courtroom thinking I was there to protect my son. I walked out understanding that I had to protect myself. And in choosing myself, I found a strength I didn't know I still had. Some bonds don't break loudly. They fade quietly under the weight of unspoken truths and unchosen courage. But even in that fading, there can be dignity, there can be growth, there can be life beyond the loss. And for the first time since that day in court, I slept through the night. When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. Time has a way of stretching and shrinking all at once. Weeks turned into months, and the sharp edges of that courtroom day softened into something duller, something I could carry without losing my breath. The pain didn't disappear, but it changed. It became quieter, more reflective, like a low hum in the background of my life instead of a constant scream. I learned quickly that healing is not a straight line. Some mornings I woke up feeling light, almost hopeful, surprised by my own laughter as I watered the plants on the porch or chatted with a neighbor. Other days, a single memory could pull me under. A song on the radio my son used to love, a commercial for graduation suits. Even the smell of fresh laundry could remind me of folding his clothes when he was little, lining up his socks in neat pairs because he liked them that way. One afternoon, while cleaning out a closet, I found an old box tucked behind winter coats I hadn't worn in years. Inside were relics of a life I barely recognized anymore. Handmade Mother's Day cards with crooked letters, a ticket stub from a movie we saw together on his 15th birthday, a photo of us at his college graduation, his arms slung proudly around my shoulders, my smile so wide it hurt my cheeks. I sat on the floor and cried then, not the quiet tears I had trained myself to shed, but deep heaving sobs that came from somewhere ancient inside me. I mourned not just the loss of my relationship with my son, but the loss of the future I had imagined. Sunday dinners, grandchildren running through the house, a place in his life that felt secure. When the tears finally stopped, I packed the box back up, but I didn't hide it away again. I placed it on a shelf where I could see it. I wasn't erasing my past. I was learning to live alongside it. It was around that time that my attorney called again, not with bad news, but with a final confirmation that everything had been settled cleanly. No appeals, no loose ends. When I hung up the phone, I felt an unexpected wave of relief wash over me. The legal chapter was truly closed. No more letters, no more threats disguised as formal language, no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. I treated myself to a cup of coffee at a small cafe I used to pass by but never had time to stop in. I sat by the window, watching strangers live their ordinary lives, and realized how much of my own life I had put on hold. I had been so focused on being a mother, on holding my family together, that I had forgotten who I was outside of that role. So I started asking myself questions I hadn't asked in decades. What do I enjoy? What do I want my days to look like? Who am I when I'm not trying to fix someone else's mistakes? The answers came slowly, but they came. I signed up for a writing class at the community center. Nothing fancy, just a group of people sharing stories and learning how to put feelings into words. The first time I read something aloud, my voice shook, but no one laughed. They listened. They nodded. Some of them cried. It reminded me that pain, when shared honestly, has a way of connecting people rather than isolating them. I also began volunteering more regularly, helping other women navigate housing paperwork and financial agreements. I recognized the fear in their eyes, the confusion, the way trust can be weaponized against those who lead with love. I didn't give advice unless asked. Mostly I listened. Sometimes that was enough. Every so often I thought about my son. I wondered if he was happy, if the life he chose felt worth the cost. I resisted the urge to reach out again, reminding myself of the boundary I had set. Loving him didn't mean reopening myself to harm. Then, one evening, there was a knock on my door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. As I walked toward it, a familiar dread curled in my stomach. When I opened the door, my heart stuttered painfully. It was my son. He looked thinner, older somehow. The confident posture he used to carry was gone, replaced by uncertainty. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy with everything we hadn't said in months. "Mom?" he finally whispered. I stepped aside to let him in, not out of obligation, but out of choice. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to do his homework, where we had shared countless meals and conversations. He wrapped his hands around a mug of tea I set in front of him, even though he didn't drink it. "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out unevenly. "I should have said it sooner. I should have done a lot of things differently." I listened. I didn't interrupt. He talked about pressure, about fear, about choosing the path of least resistance because he didn't know how to fight without losing everything. He admitted he had let things go too far, that he had convinced himself silence was safer than honesty. When he finally stopped talking, he looked at me like a child again, waiting to be forgiven. I took a deep breath. This was the moment I had imagined 1,000 times, the apology, the crack in the wall, and yet it didn't feel like victory. "I love you," I said quietly. "That has never changed. But love doesn't erase consequences." He nodded, his tears slipping down his face. "I'm not angry anymore," I continued, "but I'm not the same person I was before either. What happened changed me." We talked for a long time that night, not about blame, but about boundaries, about what a relationship between us could look like going forward, if there was to be one at all. I was honest about my need for respect and independence. I told him I would not tolerate being made small again. When he left, hugging me tightly at the door, I felt something settle into place. This wasn't a full reconciliation, it wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was real. As I closed the door behind him, I understood something profound. My worth had never been defined by my role as a mother. I was whole on my own, with or without his approval, his loyalty. The courtroom had taken something from me, yes, but it had also given me clarity, strength, a voice I had quieted for too long. I went to bed that night, not wondering what I could have done differently, but knowing exactly who I was. A woman who told the truth, a woman who survived betrayal, a woman who chose herself when no one else would. And that, I realized, was the beginning of a different kind of peace. When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. After my son left that night, the house felt different again. Not heavier, not lighter, just altered. Like furniture had been rearranged in a room I'd lived in for decades. I washed the mug he hadn't touched, dried it carefully, and placed it back in the cupboard. That small, ordinary action grounded me more than any long conversation could have. Life, I reminded myself, is made up of these quiet moments. In the days that followed, I resisted the urge to overanalyze his visit. I didn't replay every word looking for hidden meanings. I didn't rush to tell friends or neighbors. I let it sit, untouched, the way you let bread rise instead of poking at it constantly. Whatever that conversation meant, it would reveal itself in time. What mattered most to me was that I hadn't abandoned myself in the process. For the first time in my life, I understood that reconciliation, if it came at all, had to be built on honesty and boundaries, not guilt and obligation. I wasn't willing to return to the version of myself who apologized for existing. Weeks passed. My son sent occasional messages, short ones, respectful. No demands, no expectations. I answered when I felt ready, not when I felt pressured. Sometimes days went by before I replied, and the world didn't end. That alone felt like a small miracle. His wife never reached out. That used to bother me. I used to lie awake wondering what she said about me behind closed doors, what version of me she still carried in her mind. But gradually, that curiosity faded. I realized I didn't need her understanding or approval to move forward. Her opinion no longer held power over my peace. One afternoon, while volunteering at the community center, I met a woman named Clara. She was around my age, recently divorced, trying to regain control of her finances after years of letting her husband handle everything. As we sat together going through forms, she looked at me and said, "You speak like someone who's been through it." I smiled softly. "I have." She nodded, eyes welling up. "How do you stop feeling stupid for trusting people?" That question stayed with me long after she left. It echoed in my mind as I drove home, as I cooked dinner, as I prepared for bed. That night, I wrote about it in my notebook, the one for my writing class. The answer surprised me. You don't stop trusting because you were foolish. You learn to trust yourself more. I began to see my story differently then, not as a tale of betrayal alone, but as one of awakening. I had trusted my son because I loved him. I had helped him because generosity was part of who I was. Those qualities were not weaknesses. They were strengths that had been misused by others, but they still belonged to me. As the months rolled on, I started speaking more openly in my writing group. I told parts of my story I had been too ashamed to voice before. About the courtroom, about the smile that told me everything had been planned, about the moment I realized I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. People listened. They always listened. And in their eyes, I didn't see judgment. I saw recognition. One evening after class, a younger woman pulled me aside. She told me she was struggling with her own mother-in-law, feeling pressured to cut ties, to choose sides.
"I don't want to hurt anyone," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't know how to stand up for myself." I thought of my son then, of how fear and avoidance had shaped his choices. I chose my words carefully. Standing up for yourself doesn't always mean pushing someone else down. It sometimes means telling the truth even when it's uncomfortable. And sometimes it means accepting that not everyone will like you for it. She thanked me, and I watched her walk away, hoping she would choose courage sooner than my son had. That winter, the holidays came quietly. No big family gatherings, no forced smiles. Just me, a small tree in the corner of the living room, and a sense of calm I had never experienced during that season before. I cooked meals I enjoyed. I went to bed early. I allowed myself to miss him without letting that missing consume me. On Christmas morning, there was a knock at my door again. This time, I wasn't startled. I had a sense, deep in my chest, of who it might be. My son stood there with a small gift bag in his hands, no wife beside him, no tension in his shoulders, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. He said, "I won't stay long. I just wanted to give you this." Inside the bag was a simple scarf, blue, the color I used to wear when he was little because he said it reminded him of the sky. My throat tightened. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. We stood there for a moment, awkward but not hostile. He didn't ask to come in, I didn't invite him, and that was okay. Respect, I was learning, often showed itself in restraint. As he walked away, I realized something else had changed. I no longer measured my worth by how much access he gave me. I measured it by how peacefully I lived. Later that day, I wrapped myself in the scarf and sat by the window watching snow fall lightly onto the street. I thought about that courtroom again, the way my son stared at his shoes, the way his wife smiled at me like I was already defeated. She had been wrong. I wasn't defeated. I was forged. That experience stripped me down to my core and forced me to see myself clearly. Not just as a mother, but as a woman with her own identity, her own limits, her own right to dignity. If I could speak to the woman I was before that day, the one walking into the courtroom clutching her purse and her hope, I would tell her this: you will survive this. You will lose something precious, yes, but you will gain yourself in return. And that trade, painful as it is, may be the most honest one you ever make. The bond between a parent and child is complex, layered with love, expectation, fear, and sacrifice. Sometimes it bends, sometimes it breaks, and sometimes it transforms into something quieter, more careful, but still real. I don't know what the future holds for my son and me. I don't pretend to have answers anymore. What I do know is this: I walked into that courtroom believing my role was to protect him at all costs. I walked out understanding my greatest responsibility was to protect my own soul. And in doing so, I found a strength that no court ruling could ever take away.
When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. As winter slowly gave way to spring, I noticed how much lighter my days felt, not because everything had been fixed, but because I was no longer carrying what never truly belonged to me in the first place. I stopped waking up with that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. I stopped rehearsing conversations that might never happen. I stopped bracing myself for disappointment before the day had even begun. Healing, I learned, doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it slips in quietly, disguised as routine. I planted flowers along the front of the house that spring. simple ones, nothing extravagant. I dug into the soil with my bare hands, feeling the cool earth under my fingers, reminding myself that growth requires patience and care. As I worked, I thought about how much of my life I had spent tending to others while neglecting my own roots. That realization no longer filled me with regret, it filled me with resolve. My son continued to reach out occasionally, not frequently, not desperately, just enough to let me know he was trying in his own cautious way. I could sense his uncertainty in every message, as if he was testing the ground beneath his feet, afraid one wrong step might cause everything to collapse again. I answered honestly, but carefully. I no longer softened truths to protect him from discomfort. When he asked how I was, I told him. When he asked about the past, I didn't rewrite it to make him feel better. I spoke plainly, without accusation, without bitterness. That balance had taken me a lifetime to learn. One afternoon, he asked if we could meet for lunch. I sat with that message for a long time. I checked in with myself, something I had never done before. Was I ready? Was I saying yes out of hope, fear, or genuine willingness? When the answer finally came, it was calm. Yes, I replied, we can. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes, neutral ground. That felt important. When he walked in, I noticed how he scanned the room, his eyes landing on me cautiously, like someone approaching an animal they weren't sure would bite. I smiled gently. He relaxed, just a little. Lunch was quiet at first. We talked about safe things, work, the weather, ordinary life. Slowly, the conversation deepened, not because we forced it, but because silence created space for honesty. I didn't know how to choose, he admitted at one point, staring into his coffee. I studied his face, the familiar lines now etched deeper by stress and regret. Choosing silence was still a choice, I said softly, and it cost us both. He nodded, tears gathering in his eyes. I know. That acknowledgement mattered more to me than any apology ever could. We didn't talk much about his wife. I didn't ask. He didn't offer. I understood then that whatever was happening in their marriage was his journey to navigate. I had stepped out of that triangle, and I had no intention of stepping back in. When we parted that afternoon, he hugged me, not the tight, desperate embrace of someone afraid of losing you again, but a careful one, respectful, real. As I drove home, I felt neither elated nor devastated, just steady, and that steadiness told me I was healing. In the months that followed, I noticed subtle changes in myself. I stopped explaining my decisions to people who hadn't earned an explanation. I stopped shrinking when someone disagreed with me. I spoke up sooner. I walked away faster when something felt wrong. Strength, I realized, wasn't loud. It was consistent. One evening, I received a message from my son that caught me off guard. He told me he and his wife were attending counseling. He didn't ask for my opinion. He didn't place blame. He simply shared it. I read the message twice before responding. I hope it brings clarity, I wrote, and I meant it, for both of them. What I didn't say was that clarity doesn't always save relationships. Sometimes it simply reveals what has been broken all along. Around that time, my writing instructor encouraged me to submit one of my pieces to a local anthology. I hesitated. My story felt too personal, too exposed. But something inside me whispered that hiding had never truly protected me. I submitted it. When I received the acceptance email weeks later, I cried, not because I wanted recognition, but because my voice, once silenced in a courtroom, had found its way back into the world. At the small reading event, as I stood behind the podium with trembling hands, I spoke about betrayal, resilience, and the quiet courage it takes to walk away from roles that hurt us.
When I finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then people began to clap. Some wiped away tears. Others nodded, understanding written across their faces. In that moment, I felt something close to redemption, not because my pain had been justified, but because it had been transformed. After the event, a woman approached me, older than me, softer around the edges. She took my hand and said, "I wish I had learned this before I lost myself trying to save my family." Her words stayed with me long after she walked away. Family, I had learned, is not about how much you endure, it's about how much truth you allow. One evening, months later, my son called me, not texted, called. His voice sounded steadier than it had in a long time. He said, "I just wanted you to know that I'm starting to understand what I did and what it cost." I closed my eyes, letting his words settle. "Understanding is a beginning," I replied. "What you do with it matters more." There was silence on the line, not awkward, thoughtful. "I'm trying," he said. "I see that," I answered, and for the first time it was true. When we hung up, I didn't feel the urge to cling to that moment or demand more. I trusted the process. Whatever relationship we were rebuilding would grow at its own pace or not at all. Either way, I would be okay. Sometimes I still think about that courtroom, the way my son stared at his shoes, the way his wife smiled at me like she had already won. I understand now that what she thought was victory was merely control, and control never lasts. What lasts is integrity. That day took something from me, yes, but it also gave me something I might never have found otherwise, a clear sense of self, a boundary that could not be crossed again, a life defined not by sacrifice alone, but by self-respect. I no longer measure my success by how needed I am. I measure it by how whole I feel. And as I sit here now, watching the evening light fade across the same street I once returned to in shock and grief, I know this with certainty. I didn't lose everything in that courtroom. I found myself.
When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. There is a quiet kind of strength that only comes after everything loud has already happened, after the arguments, the accusations, the courtroom speeches, and the shattered illusions. That was the season I found myself in next. No more storms, just long, honest stretches of calm where I could finally hear my own thoughts without interruption. I began to notice how differently I carried myself. My shoulders were no longer tense when the phone rang. My heart no longer raced when an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I had stopped waiting for the next emotional blow. I had accepted that whatever came next, I would meet it standing. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork to shred what I no longer needed, I came across copies of the court documents. For a moment, my hand froze. Months earlier, just seeing those pages would have sent a jolt through my chest. Now, I felt something closer to distance, not indifference, but perspective. I read through them slowly, the accusations, the statements, the cold, formal language that tried to compress my entire life into legal terms. Then I fed each page into the shredder, listening to the steady mechanical hum as the past was reduced to thin strips of paper. I wasn't erasing history, I was releasing it. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself and ate at the table instead of the couch. A small thing, but intentional.
I had spent years eating wherever I could while tending to someone else's needs. Sitting down properly felt like an act of self-respect. As I washed the dishes, I thought about my son again, not with longing or resentment, but with realism. I saw him now as a man shaped by his own fears and weaknesses, just as I had been shaped by mine. Loving him didn't mean pretending he hadn't hurt me. It meant accepting him as he was, not as I wished he could be. A few weeks later, he invited me to attend a small family gathering. Just his side of the family, he said. No pressure, no expectations. I thanked him and told him I needed time to think about it. In the past, I would have said yes immediately, afraid that hesitation might be interpreted as rejection. Now I paused. I imagined myself in that room. How would I feel? Safe or exposed? Welcome or tolerated? When the answer came, it was gentle but firm. I declined. I'm not ready for that yet, I told him, and I want to be honest about it. There was silence on the line. Then he said, I understand. And for the first time, I believed him. Choosing not to go wasn't a punishment, it was protection, and I no longer felt guilty for needing it. Around that time, my writing began to change. I noticed it in the words that came more easily now. They were less about pain and more about meaning, less about what was taken from me and more about what I was building. I wrote about mothers who disappear into their families and women who slowly learn how to reappear. I wrote about love that becomes conditional and boundaries that save lives. I wrote about the dangerous myth that endurance equals virtue. One piece in particular stayed with me. I wrote about a woman walking into a courtroom believing she was there to defend her child, only to realize she was the defendant in a story she never agreed to tell. When I read it aloud to my writing group, the room went quiet in that familiar, reverent way. Afterward, someone asked me, "Do you think you could change anything if you could go back?" I didn't answer right away. The question deserved more than a reflex. I would change how long it took me to choose myself, I finally said. But I don't regret loving my son. I regret forgetting that I mattered too. That truth felt settled now, no longer raw. Later that night, my son sent me a message. He said he had read something I'd written online. He said it helped him see things from a different angle. He didn't say which piece. He didn't need to. I responded simply, "I'm glad." I didn't ask questions. I didn't seek reassurance. I trusted that whatever understanding he was gaining had to come from within, not from my guidance. Spring turned into summer, and my days filled with simple pleasures: morning coffee on the porch, long walks with music playing softly in my ears, conversations with friends that didn't revolve around crisis or damage control. One afternoon, a neighbor asked me if I ever felt lonely living alone. I considered the question carefully. I said, "I feel alone sometimes, but I don't feel lonely anymore. There's a difference. Loneliness is the absence of connection. Being alone can be a choice, a sanctuary." That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual. I noticed the lines on my face, the subtle changes time and stress had etched there. Instead of criticizing them, I traced them gently with my fingertips. These lines told a story, one of survival, one of learning. I thought again about that smile in the courtroom, the one that was meant to diminish me, to make me feel small and defeated. I understood now that it had never been about me at all. It was about control, about winning a narrative. But life isn't a courtroom forever. Stories don't end at verdicts. I had stepped out of the role I was assigned and into one I chose for myself. Some evenings, I still miss the version of my son who used to laugh freely, who sought my advice without fear of conflict. I allow myself that grief. I don't rush it away or dress it up as forgiveness before it's ready. Grief, like healing, moves at its own pace. What comforts me is knowing that whatever relationship we build from here will be grounded in truth, not obligation. And if it remains distant, that distance will no longer define my worth. I am more than the worst thing someone tried to say about me. I am more than the silence that followed my pain. I am the woman who walked into a courtroom and walked out with her integrity intact. And that knowledge carries me forward, steady and unafraid, into whatever comes next.
When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. By the time autumn arrived again, I realized how far I had come without marking it. Healing doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, like a season change you only notice when the air feels different on your skin. The mornings were cooler now, and I found myself reaching for a sweater without thinking, wrapping it around me the way I once wrapped my life around everyone else. My relationship with my son had settled into something steady, though still careful. We spoke every couple of weeks, sometimes more, sometimes less. The conversations no longer felt strained or loaded. They were honest, simple, and respectful. There were still things we didn't say, but they were no longer buried under fear. They were simply waiting for the right time, or perhaps they didn't need to be said at all. One afternoon, he asked if he could come by to help me fix a loose cabinet door in the kitchen. It was such a small request that it almost made me smile. Not a crisis, not a plea, just help. When he arrived, he brought his tools and an awkward half smile. As he worked, we talked about nothing important, the weather, a show we both liked, a recipe he had tried recently. Watching him move around my kitchen, I felt a strange mix of familiarity and distance. He was my son, but he was also a guest in my life now. When he finished, he lingered by the counter. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "I'm trying to do things differently." I nodded. "I can see that." He hesitated, then added, "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't want to be the man I was back then." That honesty mattered. I didn't rush to comfort him. I didn't absolve him. I simply said, "Growth takes time." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table and let myself feel both proud and sad. Proud that he was finally facing himself, sad that it had taken so much damage to get there. Around that same time, I received an email from the anthology publisher. They were planning a small panel discussion and wanted me to speak about writing through personal trauma. My first instinct was to decline. I wasn't sure I wanted to step fully into that space yet, to be seen as the woman with the courtroom story. But then I remembered how often my silence had been mistaken for consent. I agreed. At the panel, I sat beside people who had survived different kinds of loss: divorce, estrangement, financial ruin. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't dramatize my experience. I spoke calmly, truthfully. I talked about how betrayal from strangers hurts, but betrayal from family reshapes you. I talked about the danger of confusing loyalty with self-erasure. Afterwards, several people approached me. One man said, I thought I was the only one who felt ashamed for being hurt by my own child. A woman said, I didn't know it was okay to walk away without hating them. Those conversations affirmed something I had come to believe deeply. Stories don't heal because they entertain. They heal because they name things we're afraid to say out loud. That evening, as I drove home under a sky streaked with orange and purple, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond my personal pain. What I had endured wasn't meaningless. It had sharpened my compassion. It had taught me how to sit with discomfort without trying to control it. I thought again about my daughter-in-law. I hadn't seen her in months. I no longer followed what was happening in their marriage. I had accepted that whatever story she told herself about me was not mine to correct. Power, I learned, is knowing when not to engage. As the holidays approached again, I felt prepared in a way I hadn't the year before. I planned small, intentional celebrations, a dinner with friends, a quiet evening with candles and music. I no longer measured the season by who was missing. I filled it with presence. On Christmas Eve, my son called. He asked if he could stop by briefly the next day. He was careful with his words, leaving space for me to say no. I thought about it, checked in with myself again. This time, the answer felt right. Yes, I said, you can come by. When he arrived, he came alone. He brought a simple pie and a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. In it, he thanked me for raising me the way I did, for teaching him values he had temporarily lost sight of. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't blame anyone else. He took responsibility. I read the note slowly, my hands steady. Thank you for writing this, I said. It matters. We shared a slice of pie and a quiet conversation. No grand reconciliation, no dramatic declarations, just two people learning how to relate honestly after a long detour. When he left, I felt something close to peace, not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was being forced. That night, alone in my living room, I reflected again on the courtroom, on the way my son had stared at his shoes, on the smile that was meant to unmake me. I saw it now not as the climax of my story, but as the catalyst. That moment stripped away illusion and left me with truth. Painful, yes, but clean. I had learned that love doesn't mean staying silent when you are being erased. It doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity to preserve an image of family harmony. And it doesn't mean waiting endlessly for someone else to choose you. Sometimes the bravest act of love is choosing yourself and allowing others to rise or fall on their own. As I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the window. I looked older than the woman who walked into that courtroom, wiser, calmer, less afraid of being misunderstood. And for the first time, I felt grateful, not for what happened, but for who I became because of it. When I walked into that courtroom, I thought I was there to protect my son. Instead, I realized I was the one on trial. He couldn't look at me, and his wife smiled like she'd already won. That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about justice. It was about erasing me. As another year unfolded, I became aware of something subtle but powerful. I was no longer telling my story to survive it. I was telling it to understand it. That shift changed everything. The memories didn't disappear, but they lost their sharpness. They felt like chapters I had already read, not pages that kept reopening on their own. My days had settled into a rhythm that felt honest. I woke early, not because anxiety dragged me out of sleep, but because I wanted to. I made tea instead of coffee most mornings now, savoring the slower pace. I sat by the window and watched the street come alive, people heading to work, children waiting for buses,
life moving forward whether I was ready or not. For the first time, I felt like I was moving with it instead of chasing it. My son and I continued our careful rebuilding. It wasn't linear. Some conversations felt warm and hopeful, others awkward and restrained. There were still moments when I sensed him holding back, as if he were afraid that one wrong word might reopen old wounds. I didn't push him. I had learned that trust grows best when it isn't forced. One afternoon, he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Do you ever regret helping me so much?" he asked quietly. "With the house, with everything." I paused before answering. The old version of me would have rushed to reassure him, to protect him from guilt. But I didn't want to lie to either of us. "I regret that I didn't protect myself sooner," I said, "but I don't regret loving you." He nodded slowly, absorbing that distinction. I could see the relief in his eyes, not because he was absolved, but because the truth had finally been spoken without blame. That conversation stayed with me for days. It reminded me how often we confuse honesty with cruelty, when in reality, honesty, delivered with care, is one of the kindest things we can offer. Around that time, my writing reached a new audience. A short piece I had shared online was picked up by a larger platform. Messages began arriving from strangers across the world, mothers, fathers, adult children, people who had stood on either side of family fractures and didn't know how to name their pain. One message stood out. A woman wrote, "I thought staying silent made me a good mother. Your story helped me see that it was slowly destroying me." I read that line over and over. It confirmed something I had come to believe deeply. Silence, when chosen out of fear, is not love. It's self-erasure. I started receiving invitations to speak, small ones at first, community centers, support groups, libraries. I didn't see myself as an expert. I simply shared what I had lived. I talked about the danger of placing your entire identity in one role, about how being a mother doesn't mean surrendering your humanity, about how love without boundaries becomes something unrecognizable. At one event, a man raised his hand and asked, "How do you forgive your child without excusing what they did?" The room went quiet. I felt the weight of the question settle in my chest. "Forgiveness," I said slowly, "isn't a gift you give them so they can feel better. It's something you arrive at for yourself when you're ready. And it doesn't cancel accountability. Both can exist at the same time." Afterward, my son called me. He had seen a clip of the talk someone shared online. His voice was thoughtful, not defensive. "He didn't realize how much pressure you were under," he said. "I only saw my side." "That's human," I replied. "What matters is that you're seeing more now." There was a long pause. Then he said something that surprised me. He didn't think my marriage would have survived if I had stood up sooner, he admitted. "But I also don't think I can keep pretending anymore." I didn't comment on what that might mean. I didn't offer advice. His life was his to navigate. But when we hung up, I felt a quiet ache for him. Growth often demands a price, and not everyone is prepared to pay it. Months later, he told me he and his wife had separated. He didn't sound relieved. He sounded exhausted, like someone who had been holding his breath for years and finally exhaled, only to realize how much air he had lost. "He knows I didn't expect me to take sides," he quickly said. "I won't," I replied. "This is yours." He thanked me, not for agreeing with him, for respecting him. That was a turning point I hadn't anticipated. Our relationship shifted again, not into closeness exactly, but into something more equal, two adults speaking honestly without manipulation or fear. One evening, as we talked on the phone, he said, "I used to think strength meant keeping everyone happy. And now I asked. And now I think it means telling the truth, even when it costs you. I closed my eyes, emotion swelling unexpectedly. That's a hard lesson, I whispered. Yes, he said. I learned it too late. Not too late, John, just later than you hoped. When we ended the call, I sat quietly, letting the moment sink in. That was all I had ever wanted. Not control, not obedience, but honesty. Later that night, I pulled out my old journal, the one I had started after the courtroom. I flipped through pages filled with pain, confusion, anger, and growth. I noticed how my handwriting had changed over time. It grew steadier, more confident, as if my hand itself had learned to trust the page. I wrote one final entry about that day in court, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I wrote about the son who couldn't meet my eyes and the woman who smiled because she thought she had won. I wrote about how I walked in believing my role was to protect someone else and walked out understanding my responsibility was to myself. I ended the entry with a simple line. That was the day I stopped disappearing. As I closed the journal, I felt complete in a way I hadn't before, not because everything was resolved, but because I was no longer waiting for resolution to begin living fully. Some stories don't end with reconciliation or revenge. Some end with acceptance, with strength, with a woman standing in her own truth, no longer afraid of who might walk away. And in that ending, there is peace. There is a moment in every long journey when you stop looking back to measure how far you've come and start looking ahead without fear of what you might lose. I didn't notice that moment arriving. It came quietly, disguised as an ordinary day, and settled into my life without asking permission. I woke up that morning with a sense of calm that felt earned, not forced, not borrowed from hope, earned through endurance, honesty, and the kind of acceptance that only comes after you faced the worst and survived it. My son and I were in a different place now, not close in the way we once were, but no longer fractured either. There was honesty between us, space, respect. I had learned that closeness without safety is not intimacy at all, and distance with respect can still hold love. One afternoon, he came by again, unannounced this time, but not intrusive. He knocked, waited. When I opened the door, he smiled softly, not nervously like before. I was nearby, he said. I thought I'd say hello. I let him in. We sat on the porch with cups of tea, the same quiet ritual I had come to love. He told me about his new apartment, smaller, simpler. He said he liked it that way, fewer expectations, fewer performances. I'm learning how to live with myself, he admitted. I nodded. That's harder than it sounds. Yes, he said, but it feels honest. We talked about ordinary things for a while. Then he grew quiet, staring out at the street. Do you ever think about that day? He asked. I didn't pretend to misunderstand. The courtroom? I asked. Yes. All the time, I answered honestly, but not the way I used to. He looked at me, curiosity flickering across his face. I think about it as the day everything stopped being pretend, I continued. Painful as it was, it stripped away the lies, including the ones I told myself. He swallowed hard. I hated myself that day, he said. I just didn't know how to stop. I reached out then, placing my hand over his, not to rescue him, just to acknowledge him. Knowing that now matters, I said. He nodded, eyes glossy. I don't expect you to forget, he said. I won't, I said gently, but I don't need to relive it either. That distinction seemed to settle something inside him. After he left, I stayed on the porch, letting the quiet stretch. I realized that this This calm clarity was what healing had been leading me toward all along. Not amnesia, not reunion at any cost, but peace without denial. Later that week, I received an invitation to speak at a regional storytelling conference. The topic was resilience. I almost laughed when I read the email. Years earlier, I wouldn't have believed anyone would associate that word with me. I had thought resilience meant enduring silently, absorbing damage without complaint. Now, I knew better. At the conference, I stood before a room of strangers and spoke without trembling. I told them about the cost of silence, about how easily love can be weaponized against those who give too freely. I spoke about the danger of confusing sacrifice with virtue and about the quiet strength of choosing yourself when the world expects you to disappear. I didn't name my son. I didn't vilify his wife. I focused on the truth that mattered most. When I finished, the applause felt distant, almost irrelevant. What mattered were the faces, people nodding, people crying softly, people recognizing themselves in my words. Afterward, a young man approached me. He couldn't have been much older than my son. "I haven't spoken to my mother in years," he said. "I always told myself she deserved it. Now I'm not so sure." I looked at him carefully. "Reflection doesn't mean condemnation," I said. "It just means you're willing to look again." He thanked me and walked away, leaving me with a familiar ache and a familiar hope. That evening, I called my son. I told him about the conference, about the young man. There was a long silence on the line. "I wish I had listened sooner," he finally said. "So do I replied. "But we're here now." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought again of the woman I used to be, the one who walked into that courtroom believing her worth was measured by how much she was willing to endure, the one who believed love meant self-sacrifice without limit. I wish I could sit beside her and whisper what I know now. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to tell the truth. You are allowed to walk away even from people you love if staying means losing yourself. I didn't lose the case that day. I lost a version of my son. But I also lost a version of myself, the one who believed silence was strength and suffering was proof of love. What I gained was harder to name, but infinitely more valuable. I gained clarity. I gained dignity. I gained my voice. The courtroom was never the end of my story. It was the threshold, the moment I stepped out of a life built around fear and into one grounded in self-respect. And now, when I think back to that moment, my son staring at his shoes, his wife smiling at me like I was already defeated, I no longer feel shame or anger. I feel gratitude, because that was the moment everything false fell away and everything real began.